So this afternoon, it's an honor and to borrow a word from Ross, a delight, to be in conversation with Simran, Jeet, Singh, and Ross Gay about creating goodness and joy in ourselves and those around us. Ross Gay is the New York Times bestselling author of the essay collection Book of Delights and 4 books of poetry. His catalog of unabashed gratitude won the 2015 National Book Critics Circle Award and the 2016 Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award and was a finalist for the National Book Award. In 2021, B. Holding won the Penn Gene Steen Book Award. He teaches at Indiana University. Published last month, Inciting Joy features 14 essays that illuminate the joy, sorrow, and generosity of the human spirit, how the pain and the joy can often live in close proximity to each other. We readers are lucky to have a writer like Gay among us to distill the beauty and fragility of daily life with such kindness and wisdom. Simran Jeet Singh is the executive director for the Aspen Institute of Religion and Society program and a visiting professor of history and religion at Union Theological Seminary. He is a Soros Equality Fellow with the Open Society Foundations, and in 2020, Time magazine recognized him among 16 people fighting for more equal America. Singh is the author of the award-winning children's book, Fauji Singh Keeps Going, which tells the true story of the oldest person to run a marathon, which we were just talking about. The New York City Marathon happened today. So, part memoir, part spiritual journey, The Light We Give, How Seek Wisdom Can Transform Your Life is an insightful narrative of hope that provides a sort of roadmap to the possibilities of a more enriching and contented life. Excavating the tenets of Sikh religion, Singh guides the reader on a broad path towards service, community, and love. Once again, readers are fortunate for his generosity and teachings. It just feels like the best possible moment for these books. We need so much of what you're writing about in both these books, and what inspired both of you to begin these projects when you did?
It's good to see you all, first of all. Is this on? Now it is. All right. Good to see you all. What inspired this? You know, I have kind of 2 inspirations. And one is that, so I have this book's called Inciting Joy. The book before that I wrote is called The Book of Delights. And the book before that, bless you, is called Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. And so I've had sort of like, over the past handful of years, a lot of really good conversations about joy, like this question. And one of the things that has sort of like, kind of triggered this book, I think, is the question from some people, which is something along the lines of like, but how can you talk about joy at a time like this? Which to me is a misunderstanding of what joy is. They're talking about something else. That question comes from an understanding of something else. But to me, joy is this, like an approximate definition that I have in this book is something like the light that emanates from us when we help each other carry our sorrows. Which is to say, it's never not a time like this, you know what I mean? The other thing is, to be honest, I sort of like have been thinking about how do we care for one another in the variety of collapses that we find ourselves in, which is, always collapse for someone somewhere, but the variety of collapses that we find ourselves in, how do we like be practicing reaching toward one another in the midst of those things, and I think that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. Great to be with you all. Can you hear me? No.
There it goes.
There we go. Great to be with you all. Really grateful touched to be in conversation with Russ, whose work I've been inspired by over the years. And part of my journey in writing this book really came forward in 2016. I think that was a big moment for a lot of us in this country, for all the reasons you know. What was happening in my life at the time, I was living in New York City with my wife and teaching at Trinity University in San Antonio. So I was going back and forth. I was teaching Islamic studies, and I was one of the only people in all of South Texas teaching Islam. And I'm not Muslim, and people were very confused why this guy with a turban is teaching a course on the Quran and telling us that he's not one of those people. So it was funny all around. And then there was a lot of the experience that wasn't funny, which was hate was spiking in this country. And my students and all the people around me and all the people in my community had no idea what to do. And they were so angry and so frustrated, and I was too. It was just outrage after outrage. And part of my experience and my training, I had worked in the racial justice world and in the civil rights world. And as I was asking myself, what is the answer to these questions? How do we deal with these issues in ways that we're actually living into these ideas that we're announcing? Oh. Sure. How do we live into these ideas that we're announcing to one another, right? We're all saying we should love our neighbors. We're all saying we should respond to hate with love. We should love our enemies. And sure, we know how to say that, but when push comes to shove, do we know how to live that? And so I started thinking about who were the people that I had encountered in my life that had lived that. And a lot of that came from people within my own community who had been subjected to racism and hate over and over again. And as I met with those victims, they'd always figured out a way to find love. And that's where I said, okay, let me start tapping into this tradition. It's a story that most Americans haven't heard before, right? Like, what is it like to be a brown-skinned, turban-wearing guy growing up in Texas? Like, that's interesting, but more interesting to me is, what is this tradition of wisdom that's untapped in the West that might have some answers for some of what we're struggling with? And so that was really the inspiration for the book that I wrote.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the epigraph to your introduction, you quote James Baldwin, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. Could you talk a little bit about that? How the love sort of leads to empathy in a way?
Yeah. Well, that quote in particular, it shows up a few times in my book. That line from James Baldwin changed my life. It changed my worldview. It became part of my social and political philosophy. And at the core of it, it's really simple, actually. It's just about education, right? Like, if I really feel a connection to the people around me, and you talk a lot about this in your book, if you really care about the people who are in your lives, then what does that mean, right? You show up for them. And part of the challenge in this country right now is we're so closed off to one another that we're not willing to even share our stories. And we're not willing to receive one another's stories. And so there's a certain level of courage and vulnerability that's required to open up. And I think part of what enables that courage and vulnerability is love. So you have to learn how to cultivate this feeling of love for one another in order to start sharing. The other element of that for me was I always worried about sharing my story. I thought, it didn't matter, people didn't care, there weren't opportunities, there weren't platforms, like over and over again, all sorts of reasons, many of which are real, some of which are internalized, some of which are racialized or gendered and so on. But all of these barriers we have in our society for why we're not hearing one another's stories. And to me, as I learned through James Baldwin, doesn't matter, right? Like, all those challenges might be there, figure it out. Figure out how you're going to open up to people. And that's changed the trajectory of my career.
Well, speaking of love and heart, I was going to read one quote. So if you haven't read Ross's book yet, there's a lot of footnotes.
There's too many footnotes. It's like of the book of footnotes.
No, it's amazing. It's like this contextual journey that, unlike any, it's wonderful. And one of the footnotes reads, the heart perhaps the most reliable clock we have. Yeah, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that means.
Would you say that again?
Yes, the heart perhaps the most reliable clock we have.
Yeah, one of the things that is a footnote in, and I want to come back to some stuff that you were saying, beautiful, is that that's an essay about time. And it's about the sort of brutality of a certain kind of industrialized time, and it sort of tells a story about, what does it mean for us not to be able to sort of be still with one another, and what are the sort of violences. I was just having this conversation. One of the beautiful things about these events is that you have conversations where people raise questions, and someone said something about something that I said, which was probably something that someone else said anyway, kind of just circling through. But we had this conversation about efficiency. And then the person raised the question of, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but we came to this question, which was like, can efficiency ever not be at the price, am I saying that right, of care? Does efficiency ever not sacrifice care? It might. I'd love to hear that it does. But we could very quickly go through all kinds of ways that efficiency sacrifices care right now. We could talk about how our food is produced. We could talk about how kids are raised. We could talk about school. We could talk about whatever, how we do pay our fucking bills now, don't touch each other. That's a brutality. That's a sorrow and a loss. And an efficiency. You don't have to touch anyone anymore. Anyway, I got off. So in that sort of contemplation of time, I'm sort of talking about how my mother spent all of her time as my father was dying, getting extra hours to take care of him when he was going to get better, which he did not do. She was beholden to the clock, the brutal clock. And I sort of am raising the question of what if we are beholden to our hearts, which is maybe a more reasonable clock to be beholden to. And I also wanted to sort of say that question about love, and one of the things that this book is sort of wondering, and the premise of this contemplation of joy is that if we start with the understanding that we're all brokenhearted, that we're all heartbroken. I wonder about that as a kind of, I haven't thought about it in relationship to love, but it does seem to me like in the ballpark of love, that that we listen to one another, or we might have a greater capacity to care for one another if we know from the start that your heart is broken. I don't know how it is. I don't know precisely what the dimensions of your heartbreak or the contours of your heartbreak, but I know that it's broken. And what happens if we sort of walk that way, proceed that way?
Yeah, there's, I think for me, what I was struck in your book is just how, particularly in the opening essay about your dad dying, and how actually things felt so alive. There was a sense, and I think just opening the space for grace. And I feel like both your stories and what you write about offers these examples of grace in unexpected places.
It's so beautiful how you said that. Another thing, that it hadn't occurred to, I've thought of many things and why I placed that essay as the first essay, but I haven't thought that it's the fact of his dying that makes us feel so alive together. But thank you for that.
Well, Simran, if you want to talk a little bit more about your growing up in Texas, I feel like, I taught for Gemini Inc. In San Antonio, and I guess sort of to bridge it a little bit to Ross too, after you speak, but I was struck by both your love of sports, and there's a real physicality of being in both your experiences, and it seems like sports offered a way in, but also a lot of experiences around racism. If you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. And there's, if I knew that we were going to talk about sports, I would have asked for more time. Very happy about the Astros. Longhorns looking good. My Spurs aren't doing so great right now, but everything else is good. So, part of my experience in this country, and part of why it was so important for me to talk about my love for sports is pretty much no one in this country cares about who I am unless there's a hate crime, right? So here's the interesting experience. I'm hyper visible, right? I walk into a room, everybody notices me. I'm walking down the street, everyone notices me. I'm in the airport, like everyone definitely notices me in the airport. And at the same time, no one knows who I am. Like they don't know a thing about me, and they might think they do, right? They have their assumptions. For the most part, those assumptions are terrorism, bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. I mean, I know that's what people are thinking because they tell me, right? I hear it all the time. And so there's this really strange experience of being hyper visible everywhere I go and being completely invisible within the American imagination. And so what does it mean for my story to only be told, or my community story to only be told in moments of hate? I mean, it engenders sympathy, which is better than bigotry, but it's still dehumanizing, right? You only know one dimension of who I am. And so it was so important to me as I was talking about, at the end of the day, I want to offer these ideas and this wisdom, but I also want people to think about what it looks like to humanize one another. And part of what I've come to believe really, and sports is a really nice vehicle for this in American society, if you can learn to humanize the people who seem most different from you, then you can learn to see the humanity in anyone. And that could be on the basis of religious or racial appearance, that could be on the basis of political difference, anything. And so these stories about sports are, for me, right, like getting asked to sit out of a soccer game because I wear a turban, or a ref wanting to pat down my turban because he thinks there's bombs in there, or my older brother had to sit out a high school year of basketball. It was his dream to play basketball, and he had to sit out. And then the rest of us got to play. Like the UIL had to change its rules to play in Texas, and then my younger brother ended up playing college basketball. Like there's this, like, to your point about heartbreak, like no one would know these things about me without talking. You might guess, but that's real heartbreak. But that's also like we all have these kinds of stories, and I think in some ways, if I was just to come up here or write this book and talk about these challenges in ways that people couldn't relate to, then it still feels dehumanizing and distant. And so a lot of these stories for me, growing up in San Antonio, traveling around Texas, traveling around the country, they're meant as vehicles to create connection points so that we might develop empathy for one another. And like, I'll tell you a dad joke, and it's dumb and it's not funny, but like, it's funny because it makes me like a normal human being in ways that people at the airport or on the street might not see me in that way. So that was a really important tool, at least, that I was trying to use in the writing.
You want to talk a little bit about basketball and community and how that's a part of your joy, or?
Yeah. So I grew up outside of Philadelphia. Congratulations. I was walking by the store and I was like, oh man, my mom's gonna be so mad. She was sad. Anyway. Basketball, I played college football, basketball. I have a chapter in this book about basketball. I kind of default to writing about basketball and music, it seems. But one of the things that is interesting to me, so, my question in this book is like, kind of per that thing of like, how do we sort of recognize that we have that this, if we're sort of like perpetually sort of practicing witnessing our own heartbreak or the fact that we're dying. That's a pretty interesting quality that we share. What are these sort of practices that inside of the structures of the practices are these modes of like caring for one another that might not be explicitly like we're caring for our deaths, but in fact are kind of caring for each other's deaths. And pick up basketball. I'm not talking about like basketball like with refs and coaches. I'm talking about pick up basketball where there are all of these qualities about it. Among the qualities is that you at some point you will always have to ask to be on a team. You will always be a guest, and that at another point you will always be a host, and you will be inviting people onto your team. Other things about pickup basketball is that you might be playing against someone who's kicking your ass, and then you hate that person. 2 games later, you're on the same team, that person gives you the best passes of anyone you've ever played with. And on and on and on and on. Depending on who's on the teams, the rules will change. What constitutes a foul will be different. So it's a kind of emergent and re-emergent and re-emergent, unlegal, like there is not a kind of juridical, I might be using that word wrong, but it's a pretty word. We are the ones who decide how we're going to be together at this moment again and again and again and again and again, which is a kind of, it's kind of anarchic actually. Beautiful, let us decide how we want to be together. None of which I knew when I was playing basketball growing up, I just wanted to win. But now when I play pickup basketball and when I watch pickup basketball and when I think about pickup basketball, I think, oh, that's one of these games where we're learning how to be with one another in these beautiful, caring, and sort of sustaining ways, Like you can call next game, if you win, or if you're waiting for the game, you can call next game. You can't call the next 5 games. So you can buy the apartment, you can't buy the block. All these modes, and you learn that. You just go to the park.
One thing I just loved about both your books is that you offer, they're both practical. I felt like also, given the years of the pandemic, you both bring to the fore a lot of important ideas. But I guess, Ross, with you, one of the essays is about laughter. And I felt like for me, laughter kind of disappeared during the pandemic because we were less in community with each other. And I wonder with both of you, if there was a sense of urgency writing these books during the pandemic because of the losses we were experiencing, or what that was, did it feel more heightened for you?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I ended up writing quite a bit about our experience with the pandemic in the book, and it absolutely felt urgent. My wife is a physician who works at one of the biggest hospitals in New York, and so we were at the epicenter, and we got COVID very early, and our daughters were very sick. I share some of this in the book, but part of the experience that I think all of us were thinking about in this country and around the world was what does it mean when we are all of a sudden on our own, living in our own spaces, and realizing how disconnected we are from one another and with ourselves? And I think part of the reason that felt so sharp for me is because we have told ourselves that we are the most connected society in human history. And in some ways, that's true, right? The world feels smaller. We've globalized technology. So many reasons to feel connected. And part of what I realized in this moment was actually that's all been a delusion, right? Like, I don't know. I can watch Netflix for how long? Like 3 days? And then what do I do with myself, right? Like, I'm stuck with myself. And so this realization that the inability to really feel connection between myself and with other people was a barrier to happiness. And then recognizing, while we're in this moment or a pandemic where we're not actually able to gather, you have this really deep desire to connect. And we did it in our various ways that you all did too, whether it was through Zoom or, out on the patios or whatever. We did all that. But recognizing that actually, what did I want most in that moment? It was connection. It was like we developed new relationships with our families through technology in ways that we never would have when we were actually thinking that we were connected. And so that feeling, I think, was probably the sharpest in terms of what made me feel like what we were struggling with as a society, and something that I think Sick Wisdom had some good answers for that really helped me.
I think many things to be learned in the midst of that, and that this book is sort of wondering about. One of them being the capacity for the owners to mobilize and steal in unprecedented ways at any emergency. Incomprehensible, though it's a pattern. And in the midst of that, which is a kind of profound heartbreak, and also a kind of way that to foment that theft, the way that it seems to me, there's kind of, that the kind of whoever that kind of crew is can get us to mobilize against each other. It's very interesting to watch, study, be aware of. And in the meantime, to study the ways that person to person, we figure out how to care for one another, despite whatever, is always moving to me, profoundly moving to me. It just again and again, it reaffirms that it's, I believe in my neighbor,
I'll just ask one more question and then I'll open it up to the audience. And I was actually at a panel earlier this morning that brought up this theme that Ross, you bring up in your book from the writer Tori Denicott of, she says that joy is an act of resistance. If you both want to talk about it, because I feel like there is you offer a lot of, there's a lot of energy, in the resistance.
Yeah, I mean, that beautiful quote of Toy's, joy is an act of resistance. To me, that sort of, again, like sort of if you think of like what is joy, it's like this, it emerges from this understanding that we are connected, fundamentally we are connected. And I love the kind of, the metaphor, like an arboreal forest metaphor, like if we were to look at each other, if we were to look above, we might find like, mycelium mushrooms sort of threading us together, whether or not we notice it. And periodically we become aware of it. And that might feel like a sort of flush of joy, like a flush of mushrooms. And that kind of connection, if we witness it and we pay attention to it and we actually practice it, well, in terms of resistance, I actually think about it as more like this sort of an offense. And in a way, it's an offense to who might suggest otherwise, that we are not connected. And from which what can be done if we imagine that we're not connected, and if we're told again and again and again we're not connected, and that's everything that's on the news, and that's everything that's on the shows, and that's everything that's on this bullshit that they say is like the truth. Meanwhile, it's like the evidence is around us all the time that we are in fact profoundly connected, profoundly. So in a way, like once we start to study that and practice that, it is a deep resistance. It interrupts a lot of stuff simply if we figure out that we're connected and we start sharing. If we just sharing is a practice of the connected, what does that do? That's a deep disruption, say, of a thing like capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, just a note on that before I respond to the question, which is when the pandemic first started, what I found hope in those moments was seeing people start to recognize what so many spiritual traditions have had said for so long, which is my well-being is tied up with your well-being, right? In a very literal way. And then unfortunately, we lost that ethos, but it was there for a moment. And I think that gives me the sense that it's possible for us to get there. In terms of joy as an act of resistance, I had this experience when I was 18 years old, formative moment for me, formative moment for a lot of us, September 11th, terrorist attacks, the towers go down, and, it turns this country upside down. And for me and my family, as you can imagine, as you look at me, the racism and the violence intensified, right? It wasn't new. It's not like we hadn't dealt with racism before, but all of a sudden, we were the enemies in this country. And part of what happened, what I want to share with you in this moment is that day my mom picked my brothers and me up from school. We were in high school. We went home. We locked up the doors. The death threat started that day. And they went on for a few days, and we were on total lockdown. And during the days, we would try and understand what was happening in our country, what was happening to our country, and in the evenings, we would gather and get a sense of what was happening to our community in this backlash of hate. And after a few days, my dad said, "Aren't we so lucky?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? I don't think you understand what's going on right now." And he said, have you noticed that your neighbors and your teammates and your classmates and your teachers have been coming by and giving us meals? Like, they know what's happening to you, and they're just here to help out. They're calling to check in on us. And he didn't say much more than that, but the message to me was, it was really striking that in this moment of profound difficulty, he was able to see the positive. And part of what I learned through that, and part of what we learn in Sikh philosophy, is that the light or the sweetness is always around us. We just choose not to look at it. We can choose otherwise. And some of it, to a degree, is a survival mechanism, right? You understand the threats that are around you. That's important. But we can also train ourselves to notice those positive aspects that are constantly all around us, where there's one person says a hateful thing, 100 people have your back, right? And that is a totally different way of understanding the proportionality between the darkness and light of our world, the goodness that's constantly all around us, the sweetness that we can feel at every moment in our lives.
Well, oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. We have time for some questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Steve Amos. I run the nonprofit Health Code, and I'm so happy that I've come and to be introduced to Ross and Simran, because I had no idea, and I love what I'm hearing in your work. I'm curious, how do you handle and think of crafting words now in a community that is so divisive, so that it's more one of unity and moving forward in the vision of joy? So I'm just wondering how you kind of think about that. You mentioned metaphor, you mentioned sports, but are there other things that you are working on?
I think it's a great question, because there's all these sorts of, you kind of want to be talking to lots of people. That's like a dream. But there are ways that we're so deeply segregated from one another. It's just wild. And I don't have a good answer for that. What do you think? Do you have a sense of
I'll share something I learned through writing this book. Russ is like the pro writer, so he probably does it in his sleep. And but this was a question I struggled with a lot in my book, because I'm writing it post 2016. I'm writing a lot about my experiences with racism, a really divisive issue in this country. I'm talking about a community that nobody knows about, so how do I get people to care about me? And one of the challenges that I found myself in as I was writing, and my editor really helped me with this, was that because of my own work in racial justice and civil rights circles, I would talk about things in certain ways. And my editor would say, tell me what you mean by that. And I was like, I just did. I wrote it. Just read what I wrote. And he would say, well, he didn't say it in this way, but this is the message that I got, which was a really helpful lesson for a writer. He said, again, he didn't say it this offensively, but he was like, don't be so lazy, right? Don't rely on the words that everyone else is using. Tell me what you really mean. And what I came to understand was that the words that I was using, because of the world that I operated in, were very politicized. And by using certain terms, somebody might be reading the book and they'll be like, oh, this guy's this thing, I don't want to read it anymore. And they'll categorize you. And he said, and this was really powerful for me as a writer, if you can just get better at saying what it is that you want to say, which of course is what you want to be doing as a writer. It's such a strange lesson to receive and to realize you're learning. But if you can just get better at saying what is actually in your heart, instead of relying on the sort of popular discursive language that everyone else is using, then you can actually reach beyond those political divides and perhaps bring people aboard. I'll share one more thought on this, which has been really meaningful to me. I share this experience in the book of going through 9/11, racism, and up until that point in my life, my parents had taught me ignore everything that comes your way. Worked really well for me for the most part. And then 9/11 happens, people are being killed, and I realize I have to be more proactive. And so I sort of trace this through the book, and then I say, I didn't realize it at the time, but this is what Angela Davis means when she says, it's not enough to be non-racist, you must be anti-racist. And so many people have come up to me and said, you took me on that journey with you. Now I understand what anti-racism, like I never understood what people were saying, but now and so that to me is a way to bring people along into your world through story.
I think also that's such a good question.
Yeah.
I think it's like such an important question, and I think as you were talking, it made me think. Oh, one of the things that we can do is like talk about what we love. You know, sort of like get into the practice of articulating and sharing what we love.
Yeah.
You know, that there's something about that feels like it's actually transgressive, and that's actually what I mean. That's what I mean by that. You know, transgressive meaning it goes across and reaches in a certain kind of way.
Any other questions? Yes.
My name is Veronique Marine, and I work with children. And I'm curious to hear what about our children, because on the one hand, we recognize that they have the natural ability to be more accepting and live a life that is connected and beautiful, but at the same time, recognition of the heaviness around all of us. Like, what about our children?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah, I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, so this is something I'm thinking about constantly. And if I'm hearing your question correctly, you're wondering about how do we keep their innocence while also being honest about introducing them to the reality of our world. And I think, you know, my best approach that I've learned, and again, my kids are young, so many of you probably have better answers, and if you do, please come talk to me afterwards. I could use some help. But my best answer is, part of what we don't do well with our kids in this country is we provide them very oversimplified narratives of reality, or we avoid important conversations, and then they become 18 years old and we send them to college, and I've seen this over and over in my classrooms. They're 18 years old and then it feels like the rug is being pulled out from underneath them. And from a psychological perspective and also from a pedagogical, educational perspective, it's really dangerous. And the better approach that we do in education, and I think we could do better in parenting too, is what we call scaffolding, which is you take age-appropriate ideas. I can talk to my 4-year-old about fairness. She understands. She doesn't need to see the video of George Floyd being murdered, but she can understand, for example, we use for her the example of segregated water fountains, right? Like that's appropriate for a 4-year-old. She gets it. And then when my 6-year-old is coming to me, we can talk to her about Rosa Parks boycotting the bus. Like that's age appropriate. So I think part of what I'm seeing in this country as an opportunity for parents and for educators is to think more carefully about honesty in terms of how we approach these issues and taking on the uncomfortable conversations in ways that are age appropriate so that we're scaffolding them and preparing them all along the way.
I don't know much about kids, so I shouldn't say anything, but I'm going to say something. I teach college. And I feel like I witness not only among young folks, but among their teachers, like us, and their adults, a dearth of curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I am always sort of, like in school, there's a kind of reward for obedience. Not a kind of reward. School's effectively about the most obedient child wins, gets all the stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're the best at following the rules. I would just question that, you know. In my teaching, I try to question that in various ways that may not have anything to do. Like I don't grade if I can avoid grading. I don't grade. I give everyone A's. That's what I mean. But other ways where I'm sort of like trying to recognize and be aware of the ways that I've been kind of acculturated to want to do these things, get these people to just listen to me, follow the directions, not actually be sort of profoundly curious. I try to like disrupt my own sort of approach to that, the way I've been doing that, and to see how can we sort of support that kind of stuff. Because I agree with you. Like there's so much wisdom that in the sort of efficient drive to success gets really destroyed, you know.
And I would recommend Roth has an essay about his workshop environment, and it is, for me as a teacher, very instructive in terms of when in doubt, play.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, we have time for one more question. Yes, in the back. If you could speak loud so everyone can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you write about gratitude without sugarcoating the sadness and kind of the more negative aspects of your life?
Question was, how do you write about gratitude without sugarcoating the more difficult aspects of life? I have a whole chapter on that. And it's sort of it's like precisely that question. And it's acknowledging that so often we're compelled to feel gratitude. You should be grateful that we even let you in. You should be grateful that you have a job. You should be grateful that we're not poisoning your water with this thing too, et cetera. And that's a kind of, that's not gratitude. That's, like, I think I say it, it's like, you can't be grateful at the barrel of a gun. That's called coercion, I think gratitude is a really serious, like joy is a serious and grave emotion. It's an emotion that knows that we are in the midst of, all of us, in the midst of profound sorrow. And what is occurring that we feel grateful for is always otherwise too. Something like that. So gratitude is sort of, true gratitude is aware that when the sun is shining, the sun doesn't have to shine. When it's raining, how much we need it to rain for the crops, sometimes it doesn't rain enough for the crops, or sometimes it rains too much for the crops. So it's not a sort of, it's not a keychain. It's actually the way that we have survived. Without which there is no us. That is the kind of gratitude which is not. It doesn't have the capacity for that. That question doesn't have the capacity. There aren't any nooks for sugarcoating, because that thing knows that. That thing knows that it is always difficult. It is always difficult. And then there are these. I love the sweetness, that term, and the sweetness is the thing to be celebrating, because it's not only sweet. At every moment, at every moment. And again, like everyone in this room has a profound heartbreak that we're carrying around. I trust. Thus, the fact that we get to gather sweetly with one another constitutes a profound gratitude,
Yeah, I'm going to do something that's really dangerous and paraphrase something from Ross's book, which is not dangerous in other contexts, but not when he's sitting next to you. Why would you do that? But you say at the beginning, like, what if the joy and the suffering, or sorrow is the word used, what if joy and sorrow are inextricably interlinked? Yeah. And I think to your question, what I get from that is, what if these things aren't mutually exclusive? And one of the challenges in the way that we think about positive feelings and experiences and negative feelings and experiences, at least in this culture, the way that we think about it is, you can only have one if you ignore the other, right? You can only have gratitude if you are pretending like nothing's bad. And what I hear you saying, and this is what Sikh philosophy offers as well, is that actually both can be true, right? Like, life can be hard, and it is, and we can suffer, and it's painful, and also we can be grateful for the things that we have at the same time, for all those gifts that are constantly around us. And so to your point, and I think it's such a really important question for all of us, is how do we hold those two in balance at the same time? And I think part of it is what Ross says at the beginning of his book is, like, let's ask ourselves that question, right? What if they can coexist, right? And I think we all know they can, because that's how we live our lives. But we need to sort of create a mental model for ourselves that says that's okay for that experience that we have, for things to be good and bad at the same time. Like, that's okay, because that's how life is.
Yeah.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. Yeah, so as I said, our authors will be available to sign books immediately following, and I hope you will go buy their books and join us in the book signing tent. Thank you.